right now. And before we get started, I'm contractually obligated to thank our sponsor, the Missouri Foundation for Health. Without their financial assistance, we wouldn't be able to do this cool stuff, so thank you to them. And a special thanks to the members of St. Louis Public Radio, our more than 250,000, or 25,000. I'm sure that there's people in membership who wish it was 250,000. It's 25,000. Donors contributed nearly $5.5 million last year, allowing us to bring you programs like this. And if you're not a member, go ahead and just find a staff member this evening, and they will gladly sign you up. And also, for tonight only, if you do sign up to be a sustaining member, you get this, just in time for election season, really cool baseball t-shirt that says, "Stand with the Facts." Just in time for election season. That's my joke. Okay, moving on. Also, thanks to everyone who's watching on our live stream that's being streamed. So if everybody wants to look at that camera and wave and say, "What's up?" Thanks for watching. All right. We know when facilitating big conversations, it helps to have good community partners. So we're very, very pleased to have AIGA St. Louis help us with the event this evening. And with all of that said, I want to go ahead and hand things off to Jia-Lin Yang, co-host and producer for We Live Here.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Designing Equity. This is an event hosted again by AIGA St. Louis, and We Live Here. We're in for a treat. We're in for a bunch of stories, discussion, even a poem. And it's going to be a little bit informal, a little bit formal. We're going to, either way, ask some hard-hitting questions. But some of you may not know that before I started at St. Louis Public Radio, I went to seminary. So I'm going to start with a very short quote by a theologian, Reverend Sekou, from The Task of the Artist in the Time of Monsters. When monsters say that we should lie down and die, the art of loving and living is the sacred task of artists, making home from rubble held together by the very thing that monsters have sought to snuff out for ages, joy. Artists are architects of being, building communities where there are no strangers and only neighbors, and monsters fear that. So everyone take a deep breath with me. And prepare to welcome Anna Hines. Anna Hines is a graphic and environmental designer at PGAV Destinations in downtown St. Louis. She currently serves as president of AIGA St. Louis and as co-host of the STL by Design podcast, where she hopes to contribute to a growing creative community that is inclusive, diverse, and united.
Very short. Hello. Okay. Nope, it's okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Anna Hines. Thank you to St. Louis Public Radio and We Live Here for co-hosting this event with us. We could not have done it without you. This is going to be awesome. I'm super excited to sit and listen to it. So I'm just here to briefly talk about what AIGA is in case some of you don't know. So AIGA, which stands for the Professional Association for Design, is a national organization that's been around for over 100 years and currently has, I think, 75 chapters around the country. With over 18,000 members, we like to think that we advance as a professional craft, strategic advantage, and vital cultural force. From content that defines the global practice to events that connect and catalyze, we work to enhance the value and deepen the impact of design across all disciplines on business, society, and our collective future. AIGA brings design to the world and the world to designers. Our local chapter obviously agrees with all of that, but has a little bit of a different history. We haven't been around for 100 years. We've been around for 30, which is still pretty good. In 2017, we began the process of looking inward and figuring out how we wanted to redefine our role within the local community. And out of that 2017 board retreat, we came out with a clear mission, which was to unite by design by empowering each other. And there are many ways that we want to do this, but one of them is to start a podcast. Our podcast is called STL by Design. And when Javen and I launched this in October of 2018, our goal was to reach out to the vibrant creative community in St. Louis and to put a spotlight on the people and organizations that we believed were at the intersection of creativity and positive impact. We've interviewed a large range of folks, from Launch Code, Made STL, Antionette Carroll, who's here, the Regional Arts Commission, the We Live Here podcast, who's also obviously here, and countless more. Through these efforts, we found and cultivated a strong and diverse creative network of local superstars, and we're happy to be growing into partnerships like this one, where we get to see the community come together and listen to each other's stories and learn from each other's experiences. And that's all I have to say. So now I'm going to introduce the Vice President of AIGA St. Louis, as well as my co-host for STL by Design, Javen Solomon.
What's up, everybody? How you doing? Everybody good? I won't lie, I'm really just here to introduce Antionette Carroll, who will be sharing with us, a little ditty.
I'll be sharing something.
So Antionette Carroll is the founder, president, and CEO of Creative Reaction Lab, a nonprofit educating and deploying youth to challenge racial and health inequities impacting Black and Latinx populations. Within her almost 10 years, my voice cracked, but 10 years of volunteer leadership, Antionette was named the founding chair of the Inclusion Task Force and former national board director of AIGA, the Professional Association of Design, which Anna just told you all about. She's also the co-founder and co-director of the Design and Diversity Conference and program. So she's also actually she's been sort of a mentor of mine since I graduated college, and she's helped me figure out a lot of direction, with my own decisions. So everybody give it up for Antionette Carroll.
Yeah.
You thought I was playing, didn't you?
Good evening, Antionette.
All right, you got to give me a little bit more than that because I have been traveling since last Monday. I've been in 3 cities. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. All right, so I'm excited to be here, and they asked me to come and share a very short story, which if you know me, I'm not known for talking short at all, so we'll see how this goes. But one of the things I really want to reflect on is this idea of we live here. And part of me wants to back up and define what this here stands for. Because I am a St. Louis native. I grew up in neighborhoods that we don't talk about as much unless we talk about them through, unfortunately, a negative mindset. I grew up in Normandy. I grew up in Riverview. I went to I went to a preschool in Kinloch that most people don't even talk about unless they're talking about it being historically underinvested. My family grew up in a community that no longer exists called Robinson. I even was born in a hospital that no longer exists, which was Deaconess Hospital. And so my upbringing, my life, has been around how do we address this idea of erasure. How do we address this idea of being historically underinvested? How do we address this idea of only looking at people through their academic and professional pedigree and not their living expertise of being on the ground? Because the community members that I work with every single day, whether they're in St. Louis, in my neighborhoods, or across the continent, they are living experts of the day-to-day impact of all of these issues we're trying to address. But I'm always trying to challenge this notion of how do we change the perception of them being beneficiaries or research subjects to them actually being co-owners and co-directors of their lives? Because guess what? They do it all the time. And my way of going about this was integrating design in my world. And I started school actually as a biology major. My intention was to be a biotechnologist and to study the human genome. I was good at it at the beginning of my academic career. I had a 4.0. I had a prestigious internship at Donald Danford Plant Science Center. I had everything that they tell you should do, and I was admittedly bored out of my mind. And so that was the first time I started to ask this question of, is it really more important to follow the track that people have set for you based on perceptions, or follow the path that will make you happy and ultimately create impact? And so I decided to follow the path of happiness, and ultimately that continues to create impact. And so that path led to this world of design. And admittedly, it was traditional graphic design, it was advertising, it was marketing. But then I realized over time that design was so much more than just websites or the buildings that we're in. Design in the core is the intention and unintentional impact behind an outcome. And when you think about that definition, it makes you recognize that we are all actually designers by nature. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we actually designing for? And who are we actually designing with? And so I've always been thinking about, how do I bring my family and my community with me to be designers? And some of that path has been successful, and some of that path has been through grief and through trauma. And we don't talk about trauma, and we don't talk about grief, and we don't talk about identity, and we don't talk about how all these things show up in creative problem solving, or honestly our day-to-day, because it's easier for us to just try to navigate through life, opposed to actually understanding that we all are dealing with systems of oppression every single day. And so when I think about pivotal stories in my life, sometimes it's me thinking about my grandmother and the fact that she worked at Holiday Inn almost 30 years. She had an at-home daycare, and then as soon as she had a flare-up of her arthritis, they fired her. Or it makes me think about the fact that in my family, I have yet to make, on my grandmother's side, have a black man make it past the age of 56 in St. Louis. And literally in 2018, my 14-year-old brother was an unarmed victim of gun violence. So when I do the work of design, or when I think about my position as a designer, I don't think about if a poster looks great, or, and traditional designers would know this, if the kerning is right. Because when I think of design, I think about the mechanism of impact and change, and the fact that we could be collectively mobilizing together to actually address these systems that sometimes are so invisible that they are visible, and yet we can't truly recognize them. And so I'm excited to be here today to talk about what does designing equity look like, and also being very vulnerable in that process and acknowledging that we have never had an equitable society. And so that as co-designers in this space, and in co-designers in all the other spaces that I've been in, I'm looking at how do we become redesigners for justice? Because that's the type of civic leader that we need to have show up every day, and I'm hoping that we continually be on that journey together to make it happen. So thank you, and let's join the panel.
And thank you so much again, Antionette, for that great opening. I hope that we will dwell on some of the things that she brought up in her story. Also joining the panel is Erika Harano. Erika Harano, she, her, they, them, is a queer mixed-race educator, facilitator, experienced designer, movement artist, and earth worker who believes that everything is designed, with parentheses, ED, and that everyone is a designer. Erika is co-founder of Next World Teams, an emerging worker cooperative focused on training, facilitation, and ecosystemic supports for teams committed to anti-oppression and anti-racism work. Please welcome Erika. And MK Stallings is an educator, poet, and community arts administrator. In 1999, he began organizing events under the name Urban Artists Alliance, and in 2001, founded Urban Artists Alliance for Child Development, known as Urb Arts now, where he serves as president and chief executive officer. More recently, he's been co-host for KDHX's Literature for the Halibut and a contributing writer for the West End Word. He now blogs through Urb Arts with a new podcast on poetry to launch in April, just in time for Poetry Month. He's also an adjunct instructor at St. Louis Community College. He's a married father of 2 children living in North St. Louis City. Please welcome MK. So briefly to set the stage for the conversation, I know each of these people on this stage in different ways, and when we started thinking about this conversation and what we were going to talk about, I was immediately schooled because I started off being like, well, I'm not a designer, but, and they're like, everyone is a designer. So I think maybe, Javen, that's the note that we start off on.
Yeah. So as a matter of fact, on that note, something we came to understand and promote early on in the STL by Design podcast was that design tends to look very different. And Antionette, you kind of touched on this a little bit, and we've also talked about this, shameless plug, in our podcast, in her episode. But how do you all define the term design? Take your time.
MK's ready.
I think, well, in terms of design, I think about something that's intentional, that's planned. I think about not necessarily art, but just a desire to make sure there's something that you want to communicate, is in fact communicated through this system, through this work, whatever the case may be. So that's how I see design. And more broadly, it's applicable to how we live our everyday lives. I mean, we design routes to work. We design early exits from work if we can. We design our careers. Some of us are designing towards becoming a millionaire or something like that, or just designing towards not being completely impoverished, but whatever the case may be, we have these plans, and those of us who are particularly artful can do it with a level of sophistication and flair, and it can be beautiful. For those of us who aren't necessarily artful in that kind of way, we certainly still participate in this process of organizing and planning. So.
Yeah, it's funny that I'm like, oh, how do I answer this question? Even though I think about it all the time, and it's a question I open when I'm teaching design classes with students. So they have to define design, and here I am being like, Today's definition of design is the practice of making decisions to achieve a particular goal or purpose. Often those decisions have intentional and unintentional consequences, as Antionette referenced in the beginning. But yeah, so design can be about making things look beautiful, or it can be about how we shape structures, systems, policies, practices that then impact people in really different ways. But we'll get into that later.
Should I add?
Do you have anything to add? You don't have to.
You know, when I think about design, I think about a state of being. I'm going to be honest. For me, it's kind of like this notion of creativity and how many people assume that they're not creative. And I'm like, how is that even remotely possible? I think the only industry where like, please don't be creative is maybe like accounting. But besides that, you know, like,
All the accountants.
you know, but
There are several creative accountants.
Yeah, I won't be hiring them. But you know, it's like by nature, everything that we do either brings in this sense of creativity and it brings in this sense of the design and creation. Like the definition I just gave from the podium. So it actually IBM defined design in the 1960s as the intention behind an outcome. That's how they defined it in the 1960s, before design was even like an actual word. Because AIGA originally used to stand for the American Institute of Graphic Arts. So it was very much around graphic arts, commercial art. There wasn't really this term design. But IBM was like, no, we're gonna put this definition on it. And Creative Reaction Lab, the company that I run, we said it's great to hear about intentions, but that's not enough. We have to talk about the impact of what we're creating as well, because intentions does not equal impact. And personally, again, as someone that grew up in Normandy and these communities that tended to be very historically underinvested, I am tired of just talking about intentions. I want to hold people accountable on the impact that we are creating. And so, design by its nature is holding yourself and each other accountable in what we are manifesting every single day and every single second of the day. By being a mother, I'm a mother of twin sons. I am designing outcomes for them every single day, just like they are designing outcomes for me every single day. Design is not something that comes with an age or comes with a degree. It is something that once you are able to be, and I would argue, make a noise, because I can't even say speak, because if a baby cries, they are designing your outcome. Okay? And after a certain point, they know exactly what they're doing. There is this sense of power within it. So design in nature is also a power in itself.
So I'm really curious if we can kind of go to one of the things that you brought up in a conversation that we had together, which is the idea of being a living expert. So you shared that in your story. And I think that when we think about how to hold people accountable for their impact, it's also partly being authentic to yourself and also being authentic about what are you a living expert on. So to Erika and MK, I'm curious about what do you feel you are living experts on, and how does that design the way that you want to impact society? And then Antionette, you can speak back to them because you know both of them in different ways.
I do know both. This used to be my faculty advisor during my undergrad. Like he saw me before I had my kids. I'm like, it's my brother right here.
It's a real thing. I'll say for me, I've been a poet for a long time, really starting off as, a rap. So I tend to know a lot about hip hop. I tend to be an expert in that space. Also, my master's is in sociology. I teach it, so I tend to be an expert in that. But I guess throughout my whole adult life, I've been experiencing, St. Louis as a black artist and a black arts administrator, and what that might look like, and what, in terms of impacts or outcomes, we can potentially expect from that. I've been able to, experience the very things Antionette was talking about in terms of underinvestment. I can see how those things are sociological and not necessarily based on anything that is bigoted. But I think that it's a part of how we live, in this region, and a part of decades of history that's kind of created these networks that are sometimes impenetrable. Sometimes they do not really, they don't really overlap with other people's networks. So you can pretty much live a whole life without having any meaningful interaction with people outside of your homogenous group. And that's very much so a part of the design of St. Louis. I mean, the part of Plessy v. Ferguson and Jim Crow, that was the design. And we continue to live that design. And we have to be very intentional about disrupting that design. We have to, as Antionette mentioned, be these creators of a new space. We have to redesign things. We have to do that. And if we don't take on the work, it won't happen. Because that's kind of how design works. Once it's created, the artwork is the artwork. You'd almost have to take down the canvas, splash some white paint on it, and reimagine it from there, or destroy it, because the work is the work. So, yeah, that's kind of how I see it. That's me being all the little experts and wear these little hats. So,
yeah. Some things that, I can really only say that I'm a living expert of being me. And for me, that is being, as was in my intro, a like queer, kind of like, I don't know how to define my gender. I know that I don't identify with things. I think I'm a living expert in being undefinable in a lot of ways too. I feel I'm a living expert in experiencing the world as a mixed race person, and in being like systems and dominant systems want to categorize us to then be able to divide us, to then be able to put us in hierarchies, to then put us pit us against each other. And I don't fit into categories by gender, by queerness, by race. So part of my living expertise has to do also with that like holding complexity and learning how to hold complexity and ambiguity. And I always say, like, there's no right or more or less, there's no right or wrong answer. There's no single way to approach. Antionette and I also used to work together. I used to work for Antionette for context. So if there's a lot of things where it's like, I sound like I'm saying, it's like a lot of the Creative Reaction Lab kind of collaboration that we were doing. But really, this idea that there's like no right way to approach things is something that shows up in how I experience like my embodiedness as well. So, yeah.
I kind of want to build on that, like that last piece and the beginning piece of like there's no right way of going about something. Like when we think about the educational system, most of the time they teach us that 2 + 2 = 4, but not really have us early on thinking about what equals 4. And that is like a difference in approach and how we want you to show up in the space. We want you to fit into these confines. And we also have to be very conscious that race and ethnicities and all these other identities actually started as social constructs. They were not originally the way that they are now. That being said, these social constructs are here. There have been many decisions and designs made around these social constructs. And so I personally am not going to erase them. I am very proud to be a Black woman. And I tell people all the time, I am from royalty. And that is part of my living expertise. Okay. You know, I'm a living expert of being a mom of Black men, to being married to a Black man, and also having that overlap with the context of being a St. Louisan. Like St. Louis is one of the most segregated cities in this country. And it's interesting when people come to St. Louis, they always say, it's interesting. And then you have that pause. And you just look and you're like, yeah, it is. But it's home. You know, like when we talk about we live here, it's home. Like with Creative Reaction Lab, we've been asked many times to come to other cities and to house our headquarters there. But we started in response to the uprising in Ferguson, with my family and I just moving out of Ferguson 6 months prior to the uprising. St. Louis, in my mind, needs this work, just like other parts of this country needs this work. And so while there's times where I'll admit I get frustrated with this city, I am happy to say that I actually genuinely love this city. And I am a living expert in that as well, because growing up and coming out of high school, I will tell you I genuinely hated this city. I wanted to leave this city without a doubt. I was like, I can't stay here. But being here and going through the different transitions I have in my life have taught me to acknowledge what the city is and understand the role that I can play within not only the city, but we can talk about the city, the county, like, because, you know, in St. Louis, you can't just say city. You gotta, it's both, you know. And that's part of how I'm showing up. And like when Erika talked about this idea of complexity, you know, like equity work is complex. You know, like creative work is complex. You know, design work is complex. Like I tell people, like when I think about the creative industry, they are literally experts at navigating complexity and ambiguous situation every single day. Like when you think of the reality that many things sometimes start as just a blank sheet, and yet we then walk on these streets, we live in these buildings, we interact with curriculum that actually shapes our mindset and how we actually show up and react to certain things. That is a strong power. And so that living expertise embodies all of that. And it really centers this idea that if we are in closer proximity to the issues, many times we are in closer proximity to the interventions to address them. And I'm one of those people that's trying to make sure that I'm not just being in close proximity, but actually doing the work to try to dismantle it at the same time.
So on that note of actually doing the work, what is the role of being educated and educating in creating an equitable society?
Well, you can't participate in the problems that we face today. So, like, if you understand, like me, as a cisgender black man, it's important that I don't participate in systems of sexism and patriarchy, or at least I have to be able to actively counter it, right? I have to think about the homophobia that's around me and then not only push back against it, but make it my point to be able to educate others. That's my burden, you know, with the privileges that I may carry, be they few or many. It is my opportunity to educate others. And oftentimes in my classrooms, it is an example of the kind of work that I have to do in the community. Because in many ways, it's the work that you have to do. And so you'll have students who come from very specific backgrounds, and you have to offer ideas that might counter or even disrupt the ways that they've been thinking or living for the longest time. And whether that's in the classroom of a post-secondary environment or with a young person who you're working with through an arts workshop, you have to be vigilant because sometimes things slip through the cracks. And then the question becomes, what role did you play in perpetuating a wrong? And I think when we don't actively involve ourselves in disrupting these kinds of patterns and hopefully creating new patterns, then we are also a part of the problem. And so I have to look at myself every day as someone who has to go out there and work against things that might privilege me but disadvantage others. And that is the burden, I think, of being educated and being an educator. If you call yourself being a teacher of somebody, make sure you're teaching them right and not teaching them the historical ways that we've marginalized and oppressed people.
And I think it requires us to really center building our own humility to actually become empathetic. Because we love to talk about empathy. Because many times when we talk about empathy, it honestly has nothing to do with the other person. It's us centering ourselves. It's us like, okay, I'm going to try to, quote unquote, walk in your shoes. That personally can never, ever happen. I hate to break it to you. It doesn't exist. Because an example sometimes I give is that in the design space, we love to get an example of, oh, well, if I fix a tire with someone else and we're both fixing a tire together, then I can empathize what it's like to fix a tire. But yet, if this is maybe my first car, this is the third time this doggone car that went out on me, I've had to walk up and down 70 to try to get this donut on this car. Do you think you're going to be able to empathize and have a moment to step in my shoes just because you went through the actual motion of fixing a tire with me? That doesn't happen. And so we have to continually build our humility, think about how our biases, our unseen areas, our privileges, our values, our identities, all these things are continually showing up in the space, and understanding that that is part of the work of educating. Because if we can't even educate ourselves on our own interactions and how we're showing up in space and how we maybe are perpetuating certain power dynamics, then how are we then thus also going to, quote unquote, educate other people? And then another thing I want to add to that is part of the role of educating yourself and building consciousness is two things. One, acknowledging that you are on a journey and that journey never ends. I am hopeful that when I am 70, 80 years old, I am still learning and not running through this mindset that I have figured everything out, because there is so much in this world that is literally remotely never possible to ever figure everything out. But then also part of my role is understanding that it is not the responsibility of someone else to educate me unless they volunteer to do so. Too many times I've seen spaces where people have come and it's like, well, tell me to please tell me and relive your trauma so that I can learn. Really? And I've started to, and I facilitate a lot of spaces. Sometimes I'm in the front of the room and I'm like, Google. Okay. You're in a day and age where Siri and Alexa are your friends. Okay. And it's not me trying to say don't connect with people and learn, but people are more willing to educate when there's actually a relationship that's being built and there's trust that's there in our interaction versus you looking at me as if I'm a textbook and someone to just make you feel better and comfortable about yourself. So understand that when you're asked to educate, you also have the ability to say no. Because, again, you have to go through your own education. And also, if you're asking someone to educate you, really also consider what is the potential harm that I may be actually bringing into this space by doing that.
Yeah, education is a huge part of my work and my drive and my relationship to design. So my relationship to design often exists within this realm of user experience design or user-centered design. I do a lot of like web design, kind of interface work. I always say that I split my time in part, my design time. I have other things, but I split my design time between practice and education, and teaching is sometimes like the role that I'm in, but really thinking about it as facilitation because I may be there to instruct or to deliver content, but I'm also, more importantly, there to build relationships and to hold space to think and learn together. Just as Antionette said, I'm also constantly learning, and I'm aware of the power dynamic that we hold in positions of authority like teachers, like educators. So it's our responsibility to think about leveling the ground and thinking of ourselves as learners along with people who might be in more student roles. But yeah, I think education is huge, is a huge part of shaping systems of power and shaping equity or creating a more equitable world or more equitable systems. I think specifically within the design spaces that I'm often in, there are these dominant systems or dominant frameworks and theories like human-centered design or design thinking, loved by many and also problematic in a lot of ways. It is, some of these practices, not calling these out, but there are others too. Just thinking about how dominant theories or frameworks or practices in design often reinforce the dynamic of that the people who are designers, the capital D, are supposed to design. They have the solutions for the people who cannot solve their own problems, when actually really it's about, let's look at the systemic setup, the systemic design that is causing the difference and the privilege and the oppression. And oftentimes these design solutions or these design frameworks reinforce those very power dynamics as opposed to dismantling them, questioning them, critiquing them. So I think my role as a designer is really to co-explore or to find space and create space with other people to like explore these approaches together, to critique them, to think about alternatives, to think about ways to really challenge power dynamics, to challenge systems of oppression through design, through like alternate methods.
So in the interest of thinking about challenging power dynamics, I always feel like events like this are interesting too, because you have this panel and the people up here are supposed to all be experts. But if we're saying everyone in this room is a designer, what does that mean? Does that mean you all don't have expertise as well? So I think something that I'm pulling as a thread is, everyone here is kind of committed to learning. There's a commitment to curiosity. And with that, I think the flip side is that sometimes you can be wrong. So I'm really interested in pulling down from the theory and getting to specific stories, maybe stories that make you squirm. Be vulnerable. This is a challenge. Be vulnerable. Is there a story that you have, a moment or a feeling when you fell short, where you're like, I did not get that right when it comes to designing equity?
So,
MK's ready.
like how much time you got?
I know.
About approximately.
Plenty.
No.
Well, I can start again. In the spirit of vulnerability. So
Close that notebook. Come
hey,
on.
it's part of where it's part of where I jot these notes down. So I remember I was thinking about. Actually, I was doing this event. I was hosting it. For those of you who've hosted events before, you are on the whole time, and sometimes you might fumble over some things, slur some words. Now, what I fumbled over was someone's pronoun. Now, I had been in spaces and I've heard conversations and have been educated to some degree about pronoun usage, but what I failed to do prior to acknowledging someone in the room, and this was like an unforced error, I didn't have to have to bring this person up at all, but I did it, was that I never asked that person, how they identified their pronoun. So I got up there and I was, talking, and I do this thing where if I see somebody in the room, hey, so-and-so, that person, I just do that because that's how I show love and appreciate. So I was doing that same kind of thing, but then I stumbled and I heard myself say a pronoun that was inappropriate. It's not how that person self-identifies. And I was like, oh, and I heard myself saying it, and then I said it again as though I needed to do that. It was the saddest, slowest moving train wreck that I both was passenger in and conductor at the same time.
Come on, preach it.
Exactly. Derailed my whole experience. Bottom line to it, yeah. Sorry.
We've all been there.
Sorry about that. But honestly, moments like that, where I have to. First of all, I'm just reminded, that obviously I can get it wrong. This is why I can never say that I've arrived at some place and that everybody needs to get to this level. No. This is constant work. You have to constantly unlearn things. You have to be humble. You have to ask the important question, especially when it needs to be asked. In this case, and I'll just say this quick side note. I come from a place of self-determination. Now, growing up, my mom's put me in a school called Frederick Douglass. It was an Afrocentric kind of private school, and when I say private, I mean you had to pay to be there. But that's about the extent of the private. I don't want you to get it twisted. There's no Ivy, nothing. It was just black folks trying to do something for black folks, and in this case, in Kwanzaa, right, when we talk about Kwanzaa, the term is kujichagulia, so it's about self-determination. And so I very much so respect that. I have been saying that word in Swahili or in English for it seems like ever. And so to do that, even though that person was nice, they were forgiving, and I had asked for their forgiveness, I apologize to that person. Even though I had done that, that's what I held on to, is that I didn't take the time to make sure that I got it right, especially in a public way. And that's the reason why I'm saying this right now in this public space, because that is the burden that you carry when you get it wrong. I don't know how many of us do that, though. I think more of us should. When you get it wrong, you need to own it all the time, in all the places, as a reminder of times when you need to get it right.
Come on, sermon.
I know, I was going to say preach. You're looking at me like you need more time. No,
I can go.
I can go too.
No, you go.
Okay. Rock, paper, scissors.
I'm for it.
Best out of the
So
year
they're
one.
actually doing
Right, for real?
Scissors right now.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
it.
I won.
All right.
David's like,
I actually
really?
do that with my kids. That's how we make decisions every night. So I have so many stories. It's really bad. But the one I will say we'll talk about tonight is I was at a conference in Tennessee, and I was asked to be like a keynote speaker or something, I don't know. And they had this opportunity at the conference where you could take a photo, but not one of those like newer photos, boot digital. It was like one of those old school, like the camera was just invented photos, right? And they had like the props and all that. I'm like, no, I ain't wearing no props, but I'll take the photo. So, I'm like, okay, let's take this photo, because they were printing it out on, what's like this glass or like old school type material. I don't know what type of material. I'm not a photographer. I'm so sorry. But everyone was just so stunning. And I was like, I want this photo. And so he takes a photo. It was a he. He takes a photo of me. And they finally print it out, and you couldn't see me. I'm a black woman. I have darker melanin, but I tend to be still more kind of like middle melanin or whatever. So you couldn't see me. So then I'm looking at this, and I'm like, I have to put it in the light to see my silhouette. Like, this is how bad it is. And so I take a photo, and I put it on Instagram in two ways. I put it on Instagram as an Instagram story, and then I put it on Instagram as a post. In the Instagram story, I was essentially ranting about how, even through the lens of photography, people of color were excluded and how this is problematic and, blah, blah, blah. But in my Instagram post, I made a joke that I need to stay out of the sun, LOL. So then a friend of mine, she, you know where this is going, right? So a friend of mine reached out like, really, sis? Like, there's nothing wrong with being in the sun, wear your sunscreen, like she went into all that. And essentially was like, there's nothing wrong with being darker skin. And, this is when I talk about the intention's not the same as impact. So my first reaction was, and literally I have screenshots of the post. Because it was bad. I was like, you don't understand what I'm saying. That's not what I meant. You read it wrong. Then she called me being, essentially perpetuating colorism. And then I'm like, how dare you? Like, I work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. No, seriously, I wrote that. It was bad. Like, wow. Full on, how dare you? And I thankfully, not in the exact moment, but thankfully it took me like a day where I sat and I actually reflected on the post and my reaction to the post and recognized how I was so wrong in so many ways. And so I, reached out to her and I apologized. I actually kept the post but modified the post, apologizing and saying why we need to be more vulnerable and when we mess up and have failure. And coincidentally, actually saw her in DC in September last year. And she expressed to me that she thought that when she called me out, that it ruined our relationship. And I had to tell her that actually, no, you taught me a major lesson. And because of you, I am constantly now trying to analyze how I'm showing up in spaces and how narratives of honestly colonization, white supremacy, all of that is still something that is within me like it's within everyone else. Because white supremacy is not something that just white people exhibit. Let me be clear. And so that experience was one where it was a major public failure. And I was very grateful that she accepted my apology. I also am very honest in public about, I still have that post on there. I still sometimes call myself out on it because I would also argue that people that work in the diversity, equity, inclusion space do not display enough humility in what they're doing. We, again, want to say, well, we do this work, so we're experts. And it's like, we're humans just like everyone else, and we've jumped from that same faucet just like everyone else. And part of that work is constantly acknowledging how we are showing up in the space. And so that was one of my many stories of failure.
Yeah. Cool. Couple of things are coming to mind for me. One is more like, not like an acute moment, but so I'm mixed Japanese, and I would always say, or my mom would always say growing up, like, I'm really proud of being Japanese, is what my mom would say. And I absorbed that and felt that too. And for us, it was often more like within the context of whiteness, we are proud of being like Japanese. We're proud of being Asian, and also, I think over time, so what I didn't get about being Japanese, or what I didn't like learn about being Japanese, is actually like the history of Japan and Japanese colonization and imperialism. That's not stuff they teach. Like, history is also huge, right, in terms of design and narrative. So I stopped saying things like I'm still Japanese, and there are things that I like about being Japanese, but I don't really say like I'm proud to be Japanese anymore, because I think that can have some harmful implications on other people. Like, I have friends who's like, if we look at our cultural histories, have been like directly oppressed by Japanese nationalism, for example. So I think that mindset shift was really important in thinking about how we think about identity and pride, within the context also of like equity and power. So that's coming to mind. Another one that's just coming to mind is like kind of happening right now, of this like navigating, is this, is my intention and impact actually aligning for everybody involved? So I'm in a dance company. I'm in Consuming Kinetics Dance Company here in St. Louis. And I'm a performing artist and a teaching artist. And I'm choreographing and setting work for our spring concert, which is about human disturbances, which get interpreted in different ways. And my piece is about many things, but we're looking at like human capitalism as systems of oppression and extraction as a human disturbance through the lens of water. But I have a cast of 4. I have 2 women of color and 2 white women in the piece, and that was deliberate. And we portray race dynamics and power dynamics in the piece, and we talked about it, and it's like a consentful agreement. Everyone's on board. And also, I'm always thinking about like, and talking with the cast of like, how are you feeling about this? It's co-creative. We're all building the piece together, but I want to make sure that I'm not, especially like that, I just want to make sure that the cast feels comfortable in, especially like the women of color in my piece, that they're also on board with what is happening. Just because, we're being explicit in the narrative of showing the impact of like white supremacy and capitalism and systems of oppression, and also thinking about that from a visionary angle at the end. But I want to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences too. So it's this constant negotiation of being willing to acknowledge when you're wrong, to acknowledge when things are fuzzy or uncomfortable. Transparency is super important. I think really just like checking in with everybody. There isn't like here's a formula, this is the script to follow to know that you're doing the equity game correctly. It's really just like back to that complexity angle. Really thinking about that is really important, and just knowing that like there are a lot of things that I'm never gonna know, and back to that living expertise piece too. It's all coming together of like, I'm only an expert of myself, maybe at that. So like figuring this out together. Yeah.
So there are a few questions I want to ask, so I'm trying to pick one here.
Take your time.
How, in you all's work specifically,
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
how are you all challenging norms and assumption in your work? Erica's laughing. What's...
Well, I was just reacting to the word norms, because I think in like thinking about this panel, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of like normal or normalcy, and assumptions, and like back to how I was raised as a mixed person of like, white is normal type of thing, and like you have to like erase or silence or shrink parts of you that are not normal through the white gaze. So I don't have anything to say about norms and assumptions in my work, but I wanted to call that out. That's why I was laughing.
Ditto.
Profound.
Well, I think for me, in terms of like challenging norms, again, you know, I'm in a complicated space. I work with a lot of artists, and they come from very different backgrounds. Even though they might be all black or mainly of color, they all come from different cultural spaces, and they have different ideas. And sometimes you're challenged on those ideas. And so, man, I can think of specific examples, but I don't think any of them are appropriate. But what I'll say is this: is that when you are challenged in those moments, I guess the question becomes like, will this be that teachable moment, right? Will you step up and say something, or will you kind of let it go? The best way I can put it without ever really talking about a specific instance is that sometimes men engage in, let's just call it locker room talk or what have you, and people are outside of their names in those conversations. And then the question becomes, do you accept these characterizations, this name calling, that's supposed to be, as far as they're concerned, pleasant, it's nice, it's just what they call people, you know, particularly women. And so, yeah, you gotta break the allegiance in my maleness in my space to be like, nah, I can't let you say that to me about women. We cool, right? But
I love
I
how
just
vague
can't
that was.
do
That was such a vague.
now, I mean, I'm saying because there's the piece of it is just that. I mean, it is just as vague as that is as general a situation that is. You know, you find yourself in these situations all the time where somebody says something, they think that, you know, they can speak to you and be comfortable in whatever they have to say, but the moment that you stop it, then that might stop the relationship on some level. And, you know, that has to be cool unless you want to carry that too. And it's only a few things I can carry. So I gotta stop carrying things. And at some point you gotta refuse the weight of some of the things that people want to give you. So that's all I got to say on that. I'm sorry.
So, shifting gears a little bit, it's very evident that you all have learned a whole lot along your journeys in this work. You've obviously dedicated a great deal of time into this, for better or for worse. So, working in St. Louis, and we talked about this a little bit prior, but creative brain drain, especially working in St. Louis and particularly of Black creatives, creatives of color. Why does it happen? And what does it take for creative people to really stay rooted here and, I don't know if step away from creative brain drain is a proper thing to say, but get my good side. But, you know, how do you stay rooted in your work and try and sidestep that?
I'm going to be fully transparent, again, being vulnerable. I have no idea what you're talking about with creative brain drain. What the heck does that even mean? What, no, not in a bad way. What does it mean?
Right. What keeps you in it? Why? What keeps you from getting exhausted?
Oh, is that what they called it? Oh, I thought that was life. Oh. Thought that was my workaholic tendencies.
Oh, that'll be a separate talk.
Oh, yeah. We'll talk about that later.
Right. After hours.
What keeps me in it? Honestly, for me, it's desire. Once I lost my brother, everything started to center around this idea of legacy for me. And not even like just personal, but, you know, my brother was 14 years old. So the only thing we have of him is his legacy, is his memory. which, I lost my uncle, I lost my grandfather. Like, my uncle was like 5 years ago. But they all had children. They all had accomplishments. They all had things that it didn't, let me not say it didn't hurt. It didn't hurt as bad than when I lost my younger brother. And so when I think about what keeps me in this work, I'm always thinking about now this idea of impact through legacy. I was asked this past weekend to say what I think like my theme song would be, and for me, it's Beyonce, I Was Here, because when my days are over, and one day they will be, I am hopeful that I've created impact in at least one person's life. And so that is what keeps me in the work, even when I'm tired, even when I'm drained.
There it is.
Yeah, there it is. It was that creative brain thing. I was like, what are you talking about? I think about the people. And I don't think it hit me as much until, again, because of where I grew up, my family, we didn't really have life insurance or anything of that nature. And so when my brother passed, I had to do a GoFundMe. And we received $14,000 in donations to bury him. And that was the moment that I realized that I've been creating an impact. And I struggle as a Black woman, again, being vulnerable, and not knowing my ancestors. I struggle with the fact that I don't know their legacy beyond me. Like, we are the living legacies, right? Like, I want to clarify that. But I don't know my ancestors' names. Like, on my father's side, I didn't learn until I was like early 20s, even my dad's parents' names, because they had passed when he was a teenager. And so anyone beyond them, I don't know, And so now I'm really big on this idea of legacy and just trying to create this ripple effect and impact. And so that sustains me. That keeps me going. Besides like Real Housewives of Atlanta or House Hunter.
Real talk.
That keeps me going too.
Well, so the way I take that question, I just think about depopulation. I think about people leaving the region. And, St. Louis has been beset by that problem since the mid-20th century, right? So people have been leaving with our population being less than half of what it was back at its peak. Of course, part of that meant that people either lost jobs, they lost capacity to work in this area because the economy started shifting. There's a lot of economic or sociological answers to that question. But I guess what I'll focus on is while people were leaving St. Louis and they found various reasons to leave, there was a group of artists. Some of you may have been familiar with them. They were a part of what's called the Black Artist Group, right? So in 1968, they formed BAG with the assist from Catherine Dunham and what she was doing in East St. Louis. Got a couple of major grants from foundations. They were able to do some artist in residence programs throughout the city. They were based mainly on the north side in an industrial area in a warehouse. But because they weren't able to sustain their efforts about 4 years into their project, 4 years into their organization, because they were a nonprofit, they had to close their doors. They lost funding. Part of it during that period of time was AIGA was on its last leg, the housing project. There were a number of people who were engaging in a rent strike because the St. Louis Housing Authority and the politicians and the people that be and the influencers all kind of made it very difficult to be able to maintain their property. And then you had some people who were associated with BAG, maybe even a part of BAG, artists, Black artists, who needed somebody who was going to fight with them. And so you had some people who were members of BAG who were participating in these kind of, protests. That sort of structural critique did not sit well with the funders. And at some point, they ended up losing all of their funding, right? And they really couldn't function after that. So what did the members do? Well, the members left. The members moved to like New York. They moved to, because they're musicians, they were looking for places to gig. They wanted to explore. So there's a great, if you Google BAG, the Black Artist Group, you'll see this album cover of these musicians who went to Paris and they were able to do their thing. And I mean, they still had roots in St. Louis. There were still artists in St. Louis, but that was a part of that drain, you know? That was a part of that depopulation of the region where we lost some critical creatives that could have radically transformed our landscape if they would have figured out a way to be sustainable. Because they couldn't figure that out and because there weren't people there to help them do that, they had to go. And so we've lost 50 years of potential art making by Black artists who could have built something that would be sustainable, that artists of color can potentially participate in today. And what do you have now? You have us. We up here doing our thing, you know, Creative Action Lab. You got Herb Arts and other organizations. But honestly, you know, we would all be better off if they figured out a way to be as sustainable as some of these organizations that have been around for decades were funded, were substantial in their impacts, and people recognize those efforts. So that's kind of how I see it. I think that that sort of depopulation, the loss of different kinds of jobs, the lack of support makes it difficult for the creative to stay in the city, especially when you see other areas that do a much better job of propping up or supporting their artists with different kinds of gigs, stuff like that. So I mean, I think that's all a part of the mix. You know, if you don't have a gig and you want a gig, you're gonna go where the gig is. And if the gig isn't in St. Louis, you're gonna leave. So the question is, what kind of economy do we need to have to ensure that we have creatives that are going to continue to make St. Louis a dope place to live?
And I want to say, I also heard in your story like this idea of disinvestment, and I'm gonna be just honest. Creative Reaction Lab is not primarily funded by St. Louis agencies. We didn't start receiving funding from St. Louis agencies until about a year ago. If it was not for national support, we would not exist. And it sucks. And there's times when I'm in a meeting or in a room with funders and they're like, well, why are you not doing more work in St. Louis? It's like St. Louis still has a hard time to supporting us. Like, let's be honest, we're in Missouri, the show me state, right? And we like to fund institutions that make us feel more comfortable. And honestly, our work is around making you uncomfortable to actually grow. And so being here in St. Louis for Creative Reaction Lab very much is a choice, because we're not sustained here by financial. I would say we're sustained here by the people. I will say that. But it is very difficult being a Black woman creative founder and trying to do work in this city. So thank you for bringing up that point, because that is truth.
Yeah, when I hear creative brain drain, I think about talent leaving because there isn't opportunity or there isn't investment in talent, especially in Black, Indigenous, and people of color in St. Louis and the St. Louis area. And arts funding, creative funding is really, really sparse here. And I just think about what if for a moment we thought about all of the funding that goes into all of these new high rises and fancy complexes that are, I don't know, $2,500 a month for a couple of bedrooms or whatever. I'm making that up. But no, really, there's a lot of money in St. Louis. It's just how it's distributed is really wild and disproportionate and inequitable. And so then we have things like creative brain drain. So because people don't feel like they have the access or the opportunities here.
So maybe one more question before we close. What do you think, Javen?
Well, what do you all think?
Yeah.
I mean,
Let
are
me
we
answer
taking
John's
audience
question with-
Well, I think what I want to do is just ask one question. Then we got MK has a poem, and then everyone can mix and mingle, because that's what I feel oftentimes with these events, that people do want to meet. Yeah? Cool.
Y'all don't care, do
Cool.
you?
Cool.
You don't even
All right.
care.
All right.
I see it in you.
So one of the things that struck me when we all talked together was this idea that, you know, everyone will have a lot of different answers about what it means to design towards equity. What are the outcomes? How to get there? But there's another way to ask that about what is the feeling that you're working towards when you're designing towards equity. So I just want you to all sit with that for a second and maybe answer that. And then everyone else sit with that for a second, and you'll get a chance to answer that. Sit with it. Someone raised their hand really early. I'm like, sit with it.
You let that teacher come out a little bit.
All right. Any answers from up here? Any answers from out there? Yes.
I don't have an answer. I have more of a question. Everybody's focused on design, but your topic tonight has two words, and
Yep.
I was wondering if people could define what they mean by equity, because equity is such a could mean a lot of things to different people. So I was wondering what your panelists think, or what they define as equity or designing towards equity. What equity are they designing towards, and what is equity to them?
Lots of nods from the audience. And we had that question on here. It just wasn't bolded. So great question.
Pity.
How do you define equity? And what is the feeling that you're working towards?
So I will say for Creative Reaction Lab, we're designing towards racial and health equity, because we have the mindset that you can't have racial equity without health equity, and you can't have health equity without racial equity. Particularly, there are certain industries we usually focus on that we call narrative and livelihood shapers, that impact quality of life, life expectancy, and the perceptions we have about ourselves and others. And those 4 sectors are education, which we talked about a lot today, but also media and technology, health and healthcare, as well as government. These are very powerful sectors that the design decisions within them impact us all. The way that we define equity is when when outcome is based on, Ford through Ferguson's definition. We just modified it. Is when outcomes are not predictable based on someone's identities, because Ford through Ferguson says it's when outcomes are not based on someone's race. We've essentially expanded that because we understand that there is a intersectionality of identities that show up in all the spaces, because we can't just say race and not talk about ability status and not talk about sexual orientation and not talk about gender identity. Like, all of that still is intersected. Some people talk about equity and relate it down to fairness and justice. I also think about, like, how do we look at equity as a stepping stone and hopefully get to this point of liberation, and understanding that liberation has a different meaning for certain people. Some people just relegate it down to freedom. And when you talked about feeling is connected to that, like, when I was thinking, my first thought was this freedom of being lazy. Like, I wish I could be just lazy and still be comfortable and be. I wish I had a freedom to, and honestly, let me take that back. I personally feel like I have a freedom, but I'm also conscious that how I show up in spaces always provides consequences for me. I have been known in many spaces to be extremely authentic. I tell people all the time, I have no interest in code switching. I have no interest in playing the game, which is really hard to do when you're a nonprofit executive that's supposed to kiss a whole bunch of butts to get money. And so hence why we have an earned revenue stream, because I'm not playing that game. But when it comes to this idea of this feeling, I want this feeling of being liberated. I want this feeling of honestly breaking the shackles of my mind and just being. Because a saying I've been telling myself the last few years is that, Antionette, you need to overcome your poverty of mind and poverty of spirit. because even though I am no longer technically in economic poverty, I'm more middle class, still lower middle class, but middle class. Because of how I was brought up through this more poverty lens, I noticed that how I show up in some spaces is different than someone that maybe grew up in an affluent community and feel that they deserve everything. Many times I'm pushing for permission opposed to acknowledging that I technically already own. And so that's what I think about with the feeling of equity and also what I strive towards with liberation. No problem. Great question.
It's a good question.
Well, for me, when I think about, I'll first start with, how do I feel when I design? What I love about hip hop, it's the same thing I love about jazz, is the moment of improvisation, right? So that means that you've been so studied and ready in your craft that you can get up there, you can just freestyle and do your thing because you're ready, because you've done it, you've done the work. Now you could just breathe, you could just be, and you know how to, get back to the melody when it's time. If you're like a jazz saxophonist, right? Or you know how to ride the beat when you are a rapper and you're clever enough to bring the audience into your flow. That's all a part of it, but it takes preparation, right? So what I've had to learn, I guess, in recent years is how to just let go. Like when you've done the work, when you've studied, when you've prepared, how do you release? Because to a certain extent, especially when we talk about the social world, there are very few things that you can actually control in terms of outcomes. Because like this, for a great example, what's happened recently with the Democratic debate, right? It started off by having all this like diverse panel, like 25 million people running for president, right? And then, but over time, that got whittled down in ways that made that panel look all white, Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that the designers of the Democratic debates did not intend to have their debates look that way, where someone who is a billionaire or a couple of billionaires could show up and make the stage, where there are candidates of color who could not meet the minimum qualifications to be on the stage and be heard and to air out their ideas. I'm pretty sure that they did not want to perpetuate things that look like white supremacy. I'm pretty sure, right? So that means that there are people who have the best of intentions and they design things in ways where they're trying to get to some kind of outcome. But as Antionette mentioned earlier, there are some things that are, there are unintended consequences to these designs, right? So I know that. I get that. Fundamentally, as a social scientist, I get that. But if you come in the spirit of love, if you are here to bring peace, if you're here to build, if you're here to uplift, I don't know how that ends in a space of exclusion. I don't know how that ends in a space of marginalization. If you are here to love, if you are here to uplift, if you are here to bring life, I don't know how that ends with people oppressed. I don't see how that's possible if you're coming with such positive energy. That's where I start. And so to me, a John Coltrane improvisation over a jazz track is love. It is emanating love. It is pushing love. And in that moment, we can, if it's recorded, we can hear it, we can indwell that space, we can feel it, and know that he meant to communicate love when he made that recording back in the 1950s and the 1960s, and it lasts forever. So I want to build things that last forever. I want to design from a space of love, because it's only through love that we're possibly able to eradicate the hate that oppress us every day. In terms of equity, equity is a goal, right? Equity as a concept is lacking. I prefer equality. Equality gets at a number of factors where across the board, regardless of a person's background, race, or whatever the case may be, you see equal numbers and equal measures of representation. It's difficult to arrive at a space like that when we look at class and how class continues to organize people like racism does. Not race, but like racism does. It continues to organize people just like sexism does. Not sex, but sexism. It continues to organize people in these radical ways that uproot their lives and make them a part of classes of folks who aren't able to access these spaces of mobility, of equality, and things of that nature. I don't know how we get to equity until we fundamentally address the continued classism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and all the other isms that make people less than in our community. Until we can look at that and own it, I don't know how we can get to a conversation about equity, because we'll always arrive at this idea where it'll be a committee and we're going to say, well, how do we get this big group of candidates of 25 million, down to a reasonable number, we got to put on these restrictions. And we don't really think about how those restrictions have always been in place for people of color, have always been the problem for people of color. But even when you have people of color on the committee, you don't recognize how you were participating in the perpetuation of these systems that not divide as much as they oppress, as they subjugate. So again, I would prefer the term equality because it opens us up to different things that we might need to look at and different ways of measuring whether or not we have an equality of life. Because what we do know is that we don't. And there are some things that absolutely have to be eradicated for us to even begin a conversation about equity.
Can I say something?
I
really
was
quick?
seeing that you were ready to say something.
So, one point I want to hit on, I will 100% agree with most of what you said. I will 100% agree with this idea that identity does not equal transformation. We cannot assume because we have a person of color at the table, all of a sudden things are going to shift. That's not how that works. Again, we've all drunk from the same faucets. Right? It may have just showed up differently. But I do want to push back on what you said because I actually 100% disagree with the idea of wanting equality over equity. Okay. And here's why. What equality in the core of a definition is sameness. Equality does not take into account context, systems, networks, where people are coming from. Equality is thinking about how do we give people equal access, whereas equity is thinking about how do we give people equal outcomes. And so I think it's semantics of what we're talking about right now, because equity is giving people what they need to actually be successful and move to the space of having equal outcomes, opposed to equality is not really taking any of that into account and saying, I'm going to give everyone else the same thing. So if I give, for instance, MICDS $1 million versus Normandy, I think it's called Collaborative now, whatever, $1 million, that's going to have a different impact than if I actually looked at what are the total resources that they need to actually be in an equal space. And so I struggle with that because we've had people that come and they say, well, we need to be, let's do work around equality. And we're like, that's not the intended outcome that we should be working towards. Because equality has been the example that has been used for centuries that makes us feel okay, because if I gave you all $10 million, one, I'm done. My job, is easy. There. I'm not taking into account evaluation, testing, actually thinking about what the impact is. I'm just saying, but I gave you all $10 million. You all have what's the problem? Whereas equity is messy, it's hard. It's thinking about how do we give everyone the nutrients and the food that they need to actually be successful through the day. That's not as simple as giving everyone an apple. Some students maybe haven't eaten for 2 days. And so you're my brother, but we're going to disagree on that one.
Absolutely. And that's good. That's good. And I mean, that's just a sign of the diversity of ideas that are out there. But
Yes.
I would say it's a meaningless distinction to me. All I can tell you is that I live in a neighborhood where, you hear gunshots, bullets fly through, all kinds of bad things are happening. You call the police don't show up, whatever the case may be. All I'm trying to get at is that the reason why we're in this position to begin with is because the neighborhood that I live in, which was once, I guess predominantly white and then became predominantly black once, of like white flight or urban flight or whatever you want to call it, happened. And then decisions are made where people who are vulnerable are left behind, and you don't necessarily have the kinds of responses. So equality gets at something a little more fundamental. It goes back to this whole notion of racist ideology. If a person is a racist, they're not a racist because they necessarily hate black people. They're a racist because they think they're superior to black people. And they could come out. I mean, they could say, "Look, I love black people. That's the reason why I have so many slaves." That has been something that's been articulated in history, right? So we have really kind of messed up ideas. But when we come from these spaces where we don't recognize equal humanity, we don't recognize my right to live and to raise my children in a way where I don't have to have enough money to be able to afford this kind of school for my child. I mean, we're in a really jacked up space. So I think we have a number of issues, and we could just disagree, I guess, but I don't even subscribe to those arguments.
That's all right.
Semantics. Perhaps.
So the feeling that we're working towards.
Yeah. I think so. I also use a similar working definition for equity of where everyone gets what they need in order to be successful or to thrive or to be whole. And I think what I'm landing on for this feeling is like a wholeness and not having to sacrifice parts of myself to, again, like to shrink or to diminish or to erase or to compromise parts of myself, to not feel like I have to explain myself or to explain like why I'm in a space, and to be able to sit with that. And also, like, I think there's also just like so much tension I hold in this world, moving through the world, or like breathing is probably a sensation that I would feel on a more consistent basis if we lived in an equitable society. And yeah, I also think that equity is not a stopping point. It's not the end game, like I'm in it for liberation, and like liberation from the systems that seek to control how we live and be.
So as we prepare to have MK come up and share a poem with us, or would you prefer sitting? What would you prefer?
I'll just sit here.
You'll sit here?
Yeah.
Okay. I remember that I asked you all to hold a feeling. I remember I asked you all to hold a feeling that you might be working towards. So I want to experiment with you. If I kind of point in your direction, will you say that word? Nod if yes, and no if you're like, I'm mortified, please don't make me do this. Everyone's mortified. That's fine. Okay. Will you just hold that, breathe, and welcome MK for his poem.
I was thinking about a poem that was appropriate. When you have a lot of different kinds of poems to pull from, you try to figure out one that would be good for the occasion. And honestly, I couldn't quite figure out one that would be good for the occasion. I will offer some notes, some ideas that I've been collecting and through this pre-writing. But I'll share and then hopefully tie it to some big idea, and I'll close out. All right, we'll see how it goes. Rivers sometimes run backwards. especially after national disasters. Think hurricanes, something that obliterates opportunities and fortunes, pummels playthings of children, dolls, dollhouses, houses. The Mississippi has run backwards. A hurricane reversed the flow of our river in recent years. It was a hurricane. It was brief. It was devastating for people who felt the rush of floodwater staining white walls, a color of catastrophe that though I've never seen it, observed the phenomenon, someone has. But I'm sure the Mississippi flowed backward before then. The 1917 disaster in East St. Louis, the rivers flow through their veins, crest the barriers of their skin, felt the rush of the flood on the streets. Their waters rose so high that a young Josephine Baker stood at the banks of Mississippi and witnessed the catastrophe stain the white walls of supremacy, but not of conscience. There's this cool story about Josephine Baker coming back to St. Louis after years of being in Paris, or just abroad. She got part of her start in St. Louis early on, performing at different places, but then really didn't receive the level of acceptance and love until she went cross seas, and she can kind of leave behind all of the pain that came with being in a Jim Crow society. So in the 1950s, when she came back, she talked about that experience of seeing East St. Louis on fire after the riot there, and all of the horrors that kind of pushed her away from the region. Talking about that brain drain. Sometimes trauma makes you exit, you know. And so I guess, what kinds of traumas are we having to heal from on a regular basis that force us away? And then what is keeping us at the table to maybe make this a better experience for those who are coming behind us or for those who are here? And so it would be good to meditate on these moments when it's easier to exit, much harder to stay, but by staying, you make it much more livable for the next human being who has to pass through this space behind you.
Thank you all again for coming out. Thank you to AIGA St. Louis for being a great partner. Thank you to the events team for making this possible. And, you know, get home safe, but also enjoy the refreshments that may or may not still be out there, and also the interactive art wall that's out there. You know, when I first answered how am I a designer, I was really trying to plant something. I was like, everyone is encouraged to also participate. And now, after talking, I think I would have a different answer, and I hope that's the same for you all too.
Thank you. Yeah. It's a great experience. All right.